My name is Nick Duff. On behalf of the Young Adult Committee and Petersburg Parishes, thank you guys for coming. This is an awesome turnout so far. This is the inaugural one, so you guys are with the history with this. I want to start off with a couple other thank yous to John and Caitlin. They supplied the venue, the alcoholic beverages. Caitlin's back there in the back. They're pretty busy right now. But we want to say thank you to them because without them, we'd be out in the cold and no one wants to be there. So thank you to them. Also, a huge thank you to Brandon and Christy Grisha and Father Alexander Witt. Without them, this probably wouldn't be going on. They started this in cold water a year and a half ago or so, 2 years ago. And they basically put on the same event at Tailspins, and they've blown up. We've gone over a couple times, Kelly, my wife and I, we've come over and really enjoyed it. Started this committee with a couple other people and said this would be really fun to bring here. They basically coached us along the whole way. They're here tonight. They donated one of the drawings, so huge thank you to them. Some housekeeping. As I mentioned before, confession is being offered from now until the end of the night. As you came up the stairs, right across the hall, there's a sign on the door that says confession. If it's closed, it's in use. If it's open, feel free to go in at any time, hear confession. Father Alexander Witt's going to be in there tonight. I'm assuming most of you have heard, but we are doing a drawing. The papers are on all the tables. If you haven't been in, fill out your name, and Kelly, my wife, will be around to pick them up, and there's a drawing at the end of the talk. Alrighty, so to introduce our speaker for tonight, if you haven't heard, it's Father Jared Kohn. He's originally from Philadelphia, Ohio, where he grew up as a member of St. Mary's Parish. He graduated from Coldwater High School. He attended both Bishop Simon Brute College Seminary in Indianapolis and Mountain St. Mary's Seminary of the West in Cincinnati. He currently serves as parochial vicar of the Petersburg Parishes, which includes Immaculate Conception of Botkins, St. John of Freiburg, St. Joseph in Wapakoneta, and St. Lawrence of Rhein. He has distinguished himself as one who never smiles and from whom joy seldom comes.
I gotta stick to it.
Father Jared enjoys running, reading, spending time with family, and shooting. The latter two he does not get to do often. So we'll have to invite him here soon, I guess. So without further ado, Father Jared's coming in. He's going to do the blessing of the beers, and here he is.
And a big thanks to Nick and also to my entire young adult committee. So Nick, his wife Kelly, Nate and Chelsea Freistyle, and then Eric Ambus, Chelsea and Eric are both in the back, and then I see Nate too, sorry. I didn't see you way over there in the corner, but can everyone in the back hear me okay? Okay, good. If you start not being able to hear me, just give me like a thumbs up and I'll try to up my volume. So if you have a beer or anything else, please hold it up for the blessing of beer. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Bless, O Lord, this creature ale, which by thy power has produced from kernels of grain. May it be a healthful beverage to mankind, and grant that through the invoking of thy holy name all who drink thereof may find it a help in body and protection in soul. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. And then before we begin, let's just start with another quick prayer just to set us into that mode, even though it's on humor tonight. We'll kind of lead it into that. And then Leo, I hear a little bit of feedback. Can you maybe try to figure out what's going on there? Thank you. Sorry. Let's begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty and ever-loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of this evening. We thank you for the gift of all the many good things that you give us. Friends, family, friendships, beer, laughter, joy, and the many things that you want to offer us in this life that you created and you created good. We ask you might bless all those who are gathered here this evening, that they may be drawn into closer relationship with your Son. We also ask that in a special way, as Father Sean and a number of people from the Petersburg Parishes are traveling to the March for Life, and all those who are traveling this week to the March for Life might be protected in their travels and might be strengthened in their faith to bear witness to the goodness of life that you have given each and every one of us. We ask this all in your name. Amen. So, as I was trying to prepare in this talk, I came across a rather funny story about this young Catholic kid from, Botkins, Ohio. We say he's from Botkins. And, whenever he was a little kid, he wanted this bicycle really, really bad. And so he asked his dad, "Hey, Dad, for my birthday, I want a bicycle." And his dad's like, "What the heck, kid? Do you think I'm made of money? I can't afford that. Only Jesus himself would be able to get you that bike." So the little boy thought about that, took him literally, went up to his room and began to write a letter to Jesus, as he would, to Santa. He wrote, "Dear Jesus, I've always been a good boy and I always listen to my parents." And he's like, "Oh no." Crumbles it up the paper, throws it in the wastebasket. He won't believe that. I got to start over. And so then he tries again. He starts to write, "Dear Jesus, I usually try my best, and I serve Mass every single week." And he was like, and again, he crumpled up, threw it in a wastebasket, and said, he's not going to believe that either. And so he sits there, and he just has writer's block. So he sits there, he puts his hands on top of his head, and he can tell that he's just frustrated. But then out of the corner of his eye, he sees a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary sitting on top of his dresser. And all of a sudden, you can see the light bulb go off in his head. He has an idea. He goes over to his dresser, he opens up his sock drawer, pulls out a pair of socks, unrolls them, and then he grabs the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, puts her into one of the socks, rolls it up, puts it at the very back of the sock drawer, closes it, and then he proceeds to go back over to his desk and write a letter, and he says, "Dear Jesus, if you ever want to see your mama again..." So that's the only time you'll probably laugh this entire evening, but that's all right. And to be honest, I'm really, really nervous about this talk. I told somebody beforehand, "Are you nervous?" I'm like, "I'm nervous before every talk. Whether I'm talking to 5 people or whether I'm talking to 200 people. Doesn't matter." But I think this one makes me nervous in a very specific way. And that's partially because, of the content. Does God have a funny bone? So there's kind of this expectation that I'd be funny. Other talks, it's just like, "Hey, talk on this subject." And it's like, I'm a fairly smart guy. I can read up on this stuff and I can figure it out, right? But then there becomes with this expectation that I'd be funny, that I somehow make this a stand-up act. And I'm sorry to tell you that this will not be a stand-up act particularly, but I hope we do laugh. I do hope we have fun. But my primary goal is to first, there's 2 questions that I have in mind, because obviously we raise the question, does God have a funny bone? 1, is comedy allowed within Christianity? And then second, could laughter, could humor, could comedy possibly even be a good thing? Could it be something that God actually wills for us and some part of the good creation that he gave to us? Or is it just simply something that's kind of neutral? And so I think it's important to kind of bring that to mind, because the origin story of this talk is not like I had this brilliant idea to come up with this talk. I was actually talking with my young adult committee about how we were going to do this. Okay, we're going to do Theologically Thirsty Thursdays. And we started throwing out all these different subjects we could do to start off. And none of them really struck us. But then I forget how it came up, but then I started sharing all these different funny stories from the Bible and a lot of things people overlook in terms of the humor that this actually exists within. And I think it was Kelly who said, "That sounds like a perfect content for a first talk." And I was like, "You're absolutely right." And I think that's because there's something within us that wants to know whether or not it's actually allowed, because we live in a very interesting culture. We live in a culture as Americans that is rather Puritan, Calvinistic in its outlook. So a lot of times, what do people think Christians believe? You're not allowed to drink. I'll get some liquid courage. We're not allowed to drink. You're not allowed to dance. You're not allowed to have fun. This is like the common cultural view is that Christianity, Catholicism are suffocating and life-sucking realities. And the fact of the matter is that if we are that way, then Christianity is really a pretty dark thing. And I think that for this reason, so I think that's one of the reasons why. But I think another reason is just because of some outright lies about what Christianity is. Because if you look at movies, if you look at TV, oftentimes if you have any characters of religious belief, they will be very pie in the sky, they'll be very naive characters, or they're sometimes even the villains, the ones who are trying to hold people back. Footloose, that crazy pastor who's trying to keep all the kids from dancing. All these different things that we see within culture that tells us that Christianity doesn't want us to have fun, doesn't want us to laugh, and doesn't want us to have joy. And this isn't meant to be some sort of like Protestant versus Catholic thing either. Because obviously Catholicism has this very big thing, because Martin Luther, the man who kicked off the Protestant Reformation, was no Puritan. Was a man who was not afraid to incise and make people laugh. He has the title of, he has this great line. He's talking about the Pope, because if you don't know, Martin Luther was not a big fan of the Pope and of the papacy and its authority. And he once said of the Pope says, "What comes out of my mouth must be kept by all who believe in Christ. I hear it, but out of which mouth? The one from which farts come? You can keep that to yourself." He had this very incisive and this very cruel kind of humor. And it actually wasn't a bad thing. That was not an uncommon thing at the time. It is something that we kind of have lost in Christianity, that we forget that we are allowed to be kind of funny, that we are allowed to be witty, we are allowed to make jokes. And we can see this even throughout all of creation history. God never condemns fun. In fact, we can see that he creates the world and calls it good. And then after he creates us, after he creates human beings, he calls it very good. And it's even kind of a funny scene if you think about it in Genesis. Think about this. The God who said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God said, "Let there be the sea," and there was the sea. God said, "Let there be this, that," and there it was. But the moment that Adam and Eve sinned, so a God who is obviously all-knowing, has created all things and knows all this stuff, what do Adam and Eve try to do? They try to hide. And what do they try to hide with? Little fig leaves. Who are you hiding from? It's meant to be kind of a comedic sort of like encounter there. Despite the fact that they have just sinned, God is actually meant to kind of painting a rather ridiculous image of what oftentimes our sin can look like. And we're perhaps even invited to laugh at it a bit, at how ridiculous we can be as fallen human beings. But then I think we even see this further whenever you look at different things throughout. That for one, in Psalm 104, God says that he gave wine to cheer our hearts. God desires for us to have joy. And then we'll go through a number of other sort of stories, but if we look at many of the stories throughout all of history, we can see that God really, really desired for us to have a lot of joy in our experience. For one, St. Augustine was no stranger to having fun, to making fun of things. In fact, he talks in his Confessions about the ridiculous nature of which we have kind of come to see children as these perfect little beings. And he paints this image of where he's like, if a baby was the same size as a full-grown man, he would rip off your arm to get some milk. That's the simple fact of the matter. He's meant to portray this very ridiculous image to show us a truth of the faith. And then medieval Christianity. If you take a look at a lot of the humor that's present within that, has anybody here ever heard, this isn't as well known today because we don't read as much, but Canterbury Tales? Ever heard of it? Yeah. So Canterbury Tales, I essentially would consider to be like a medieval version of Forrest Gump. There's a lot of stuff happens in there, and it's not all that, what'd you say, complimentary towards human nature. It's not all that complimentary towards agents of the church. There's a lot of kind of funny images that take place throughout. And then we even see in like the Divine Comedy, for whatever reason, it appears as though the church fathers and a lot of the saints throughout the church's history had a love for fart jokes. I don't know why that is. Probably because there's a lot of men involved in that, but they love fart jokes. Because in the Divine Comedy, so does anybody know who Dante is? He wrote the Inferno. So a story about traveling through hell. So it's his poetic journey through hell. But it's kind of this funny image at one point wherever Dante and then his guide Virgil are walking through hell, they are actually ushered on by a group of demons who blow trumpets to announce that they are allowed to move to the next level of hell. But these demons do not blow those trumpets with their mouths. They blow them with the other end. And it's because it's meant to be a literal flipping of the world on its head. That whereas in heaven you would blow the trumpets with your mouth and use it for what it's used for, because you are in hell, everything is upside down, literally, in this case. And Dante uses that image, and he means for it to be funny. He means for people to read that and laugh. And so we see that in that history. And then, G.K. Chesterton has one of my favorite kind of funny little quotes about what it means to be a Christian. And it's, something that I try to hit on often in my homilies, but this kind of thing. He says about those who just say, well, I go to Mass or I go to church every Sunday. Just going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in your garage makes you a car. And again, he's using a little bit of humor to try and depict a reality. He's using that humor to display that there's a lot of good in laughing, because it's supposed to show us the truth. And then even though this man died, there was a doctor of philosophy from Notre Dame that before he died, he was actually working on an argument for God's existence from risibility. And if you don't know what that word, risibility is the ability to laugh. And so this man was actually trying to work out to show how humor, as innate, because it's such a human thing. Like you might see some chimps kind of laugh, but for the most part, laughter is solely a human sort of trait. Comedy is only something that humans do. Other animals make tools. No other animals have this ability to make jokes, have this ability to laugh. And so he actually wanted to use it as an argument towards God's existence. Unfortunately, he died before he was able to do that. But I think it shows this deep vein throughout Christian history, a desire to show that humor is indeed part of our existence as human beings. And I think that, in short, that what that's meant to show is that God desires for us to live full and human lives. But we somehow always have this tendency to think that God is below humor. And I think this is even seen in the fact that we don't want to ever talk about humor. But Bishop Robert Barron, in his Catholicism series, actually talks about how even the Incarnation is a bit of a joke, kind of a comedy in and of itself. Because what does a good joke usually do? It does something unexpected. You don't see the punchline coming, right? And so what happens? So let's go to Luke's account of the Incarnation, of Jesus being born into the world. What does he do? So what happens, and what does Luke do? He starts off with a story that in such and such a year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, he ordered a census of the entire world. And then it goes on to explain this earthly power of Caesar. So as you begin this story, what does it look like it's going to be about? It looks like it's going to be about what most stories are about. A great king, the most important figure of the time. But then all of a sudden, what happens? It says, there was a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph. And then all of a sudden, you have a baby being born in Bethlehem that's called the King of Kings. It's the divine punchline. It's meant to convey that maybe perhaps not ha-ha funny, but God does give us a bit of a punchline and showing us in that story that indeed there is this kind of comedic element, this joke going on, that where we think we have the power, God's really in the end the one who's in charge. And we can see from Scripture that God does indeed have a sense of humor and indeed uses even humor to teach human beings lessons. So something that we have in the Catholic Bible that other Bibles don't have, and I think it's a book that is perhaps one of my favorites throughout the Bible, called the Book of Tobit. In some ways, if you could get somebody like, I would love to have the Kohn brothers. I'm a big Kohn brothers fan, by the way. But if the guy can get the Kohn brothers to make a film of this movie, it'd probably be a pretty good dark comedy. But in this story of the Book of Tobit, it's essentially about a good man getting better. It's about a man being humbled before God, and sometimes humbled in very funny ways and very ridiculous ways. So in the Book of Tobit, we hear about this great man Tobit, and he brags about all the many things he does, how many times a day he prays, how many alms he gives to the poor. And then the story begins, really, with him burying the dead. And after he buries this man who needs to be buried, a very good deed, no doubt, he ends up leaning against the wall of the outside of the city with his eye, and takes a nap with his head up and his eyes closed. And while he's taking that nap, a bird poops in his eyes. And he goes blind. And all of a sudden, the rest of the story turns now to his son Tobias. Tobias, his son, and now, Tobit has to be led around by his wife. He's blind. And now he tells Tobias that he must go find a wife and that he must go back to his ancestral land to find this wife. And as Tobias is going, he meets this man named Raphael. Hint, hint, he's an angel. We know St. Raphael, right? And so Raphael goes on this journey with him. And as they're going along, they stop by a river to get some water. And this huge fish almost eats both of them. And they end up being able to catch this fish. And what Raphael tells Tobias is that you must keep the guts of this fish. So basically what Tobias does is, in this very disgusting sort of manner, but also this ridiculous manner, he takes the guts of the fish and he shoves them into his, essentially, satchel and carries them with him to go meet his new wife. And how romantic, right? So he's carrying around rotting fish organs with him. And as he gets to go meet his new wife, Sarah, they set up this rather romantic scene that you may have heard read at weddings before. So Sarah has actually been married 7 times before. But every night on their wedding night, whenever, they're going to go into what married people do, a demon gets activated in her, in a sense, and actually ends up killing each of her 7 husbands before Tobias. And so you set up this funny scene to where Tobias gets married to Sarah, and Raphael tells Tobias that, hey, I know the trick to get rid of this demon. I won't give that away yet, but let's set up this scene. It's rather funny because basically Tobias and Sarah go to their bedroom to do what married people do. Sleep. Get to know biblically. And what Sarah's father does is he actually has the servants begin to dig Tobias's grave already. She's like, well, this isn't going to be any different than the other ones. And so in the background, you can see Tobias's servants digging this grave. But then what Raphael tells Tobias is that if you burn, I forget which organs it is, but if you burn these certain organs of that fish, it will drive out that demon. So, hey, honey, let me put some incense, or let me light this fish-scented Yankee candle. That sounds amazing. And he lights it, and they do this, and guess what? The demon is driven out, and then begins that famous passage from Sarah and Tobias in which they pray before they do what married couples do, which isn't a bad idea, actually. So just throwing that out there. So. And then Tobias takes his wife, Sarah, back to see his father, and there's a bunch of other stuff in between, but essentially they get to the end. So these fish guts are still in, some of the fish guts are still in his satchel. Probably been in there for months by the time he gets back to see his father. And guess what Raphael tells Tobias the cure for his father's blindness is? Those fish guts. He makes a paste out of it, wipes it on Tobit's eyes, and he can peel off the cataracts that have come over his eyes. And so even at the very end, we see this very kind of funny, ridiculous thing taking place. And what it's meant to convey to us is that sometimes doing God's will looks absolutely ridiculous. It's just kind of crazy. It can be kind of stupid. And I'll even share perhaps a little story. I wasn't planning on this, but heck, why not? From my own experience. So, as some of you may know, I spent a summer in Rome studying for a month. And during that month, we were there for the Corpus Christi procession, where the Holy Father takes the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance from, I believe it is, St. Mary Major to another church. I forget what it is called now. But take it to another church. And so there's this giant procession that goes on for like a mile and a half. And while I'm on this procession, I'm praying to the Lord, and I feel like this very close intimacy. It was like one of those great times, a very close intimacy with the Lord as I'm following the Blessed Sacrament with about 3,000 to 4,000 other people. It's a massive procession. And I'm just praying to the Lord like, Lord, inspire vocations throughout the world. We need holy priests. We need holy religious. And so I keep on praying this prayer. And as I'm walking along, over to about my 2 o'clock, I see this young woman. I don't know, she's probably in her late teens, early 20s. And I just feel the Lord put in my heart. It isn't like he put like headphones on me and said, hey, tell her that she's supposed to be a religious sister. And I was like, what? And so I keep on fighting it, but it kind of keeps on coming back. And finally I'm like, okay, fine. I got to go tell that young woman that the Lord's calling to be a religious sister. I'm like, but she probably doesn't speak English because she's probably Italian. So I go and ask the priest that's on the trip with us, like, hey, how do you say, have you ever considered being a religious sister in Italian? He looks at me weird. I'm like, please just do it. I'm like, I feel silly doing this. Just do it. So he tells me I practiced a few times. He's like, close enough, whatever. And so I go over to this young woman, and I say it in Italian, and she looks at me very confused. And she's like, I don't know, she's like, no Italiano or something like that. It's like, oh, shoot. And I'm like, English? She's like, no. I'm like, German? Because I know a little bit of German, so I could probably get that out. And she's like, no. And I'm like, she's like, Francais. And I'm like, oh, great. Like... And now I feel really stupid. How am I to communicate this? And so she's like looking at me really weird, like, why is this priest talking to me right now in a bunch of different languages? What is he doing? And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, the other way, I see some religious sisters in full habit. And I just point at them and I say, and I point to her, point to them, point to her. And it goes back and forth, and she's like very confused. And then finally, it dawns on her, and she's like, no. And I'm like, yes. And you know, the message got across, but the way in which the Lord did it, I was not necessarily a big fan of. It happened, though. And that's the way in which the Lord can often work in our lives. It can be funny, it can be ridiculous, and it can be humbling. But it's always good, and the Lord did want to, I don't know whatever happened to her, like, who knows. But, you know, like, I was obedient at least once to the Lord, so yay. And then we see again in the Old Testament about the donkey of Balaam, or as, you know, for comedic effect, we'll call it the ass of Balaam. But the donkey of Balaam is a story about Balaam, this kind of diviner, this man who was supposed to be this sort of wizard of sorts for the pagan world. And as the Israelites are trying to get into the Holy Land, a bunch of kings are opposing them. And so this one king comes to Balaam and says, hey, I want you to curse Israel for me. And Balaam says, okay, tell me what to do. And he says, well, I'll tell you tomorrow what to do. So Balaam goes to sleep. And in his dream, the Lord comes to him and says, you will not curse Israel. This people has been blessed by me. And so he tells the king the next day, hey, I can't do this now. The king's like, what the heck? Yeah, you can do this. And he's like, fine, let me go to sleep again and see if the Lord will tell me. And again, the Lord tells him, like, hey, if you do this, you can't curse Israel, but instead you will have to bless them. So what does Balaam do? He goes to curse Israel. And as he's going to curse Israel, he gets onto his trusty donkey. And every time that he tries to get closer to the Israelite camp to curse them, the donkey goes off the road. It sees an angel of the Lord, and it keeps on going off, time and time again. And so one time it drags him through brush, and he gets all kinds of thistles, gets knocked off. Another time the donkey rears back, knocks him off. And so you can almost see in a movie, because we have to keep in mind that there was no movies at this time, right? That what Israel would have saw with this very funny instance of this man riding on a donkey, getting thrown about time and time again. But then it gets even more ridiculous. Finally, as he's getting close to the camp, the donkey just lays down. He just puts all fours out to the side, goes out, and traps Balaam underneath him. And Balaam starts to beat him, saying, come on, you stupid donkey, go. And what happens? The Lord actually speaks to Balaam through the donkey and says, why have you treated your servant so badly? What the Lord does in this instance is, again, he uses this very ridiculous mode to communicate to the people of it, to communicate to Balaam that he cannot curse the people of Israel. And so we see God working in this very odd way, this very ridiculous way, again in that story. And then we even see the story of Elijah. So Elijah, one of my favorites, because he's this fire and brimstone guy, right? So one time, Elisha does what we should always do. He's super competitive, right? And so he challenges the prophets of Baal to a duel, because King Ahab has decided he can't decide whether or not he's for the God of Israel or if he's for the God of Baal, or if he's for Baal, the God. And so Elisha says, fine, I myself, as the sole prophet of the Lord God of Israel, will stand against the 300 prophets of Baal in the land of Israel. And so what they do is they have this competition to see which God will come down and consume their sacrifice of an ox. And so on one side you have Elijah all by himself. On the other side you have all 300 prophets of Baal standing on the other side. And Elijah says, gentlemen rules, you all can go first. I'll go last. And so what he does, and what these prophets begin to do, is they begin to call on their God. And what does Elijah do? Did he just sit back all nice like? No, he sits back and he says, hey, maybe your gods are asleep and they can't hear you. You need to speak louder. And so he begins to taunt them. And then further, he's like, hey, maybe you need to bang on a bunch of pots and pans and maybe then they'll hear you. And then he's like, hey, maybe you cut yourself. Maybe they'll finally hear you. And of course, what happens? They don't. But we see Elijah take on this very sort of menacing role, and for the purpose of showing the power of God at work in Israel's lives. I won't tell you the rest of the story because it gets rather morbid, but nonetheless, the story kind of shows Elijah's great desire and God's great desire to show the people of Israel, because Elijah says to the people of Israel at the very beginning of that, you must not straddle the issue. Pick either the God of Israel or pick the God of Baal. And he uses this very heightened sort of dialogue between Elijah and Baal, and the prophets of Baal, to show that choice. And then we can even see Jesus use this sort of technique. You can see Jesus throughout the Gospels actually use humor a couple of times. You can see him, be rather kind of cruel, rather upfront, and rather abusive in his sort of humor. Think about in chapter 22 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is being constantly interrogated. First, he's interrogated by the Sadducees. He answers their questions, and they are silenced. And then the Pharisees ask him a question, and they're silenced. And then Jesus says something very, very interesting. He says, Pharisees and scribes, blind guides. And then he goes on to describe the fact that they strain the gnats. So think about this sort of comedic image, or this sort of ridiculous image or idea of comedy as something unexpected. So he says they strain the gnat. So they take out the tiniest of insects. They remove it from everything and make sure they're careful about that. But they swallow the camel. They swallow the camel. So has anyone watched The Mandalorian? No? Yeah. Think of that image of where Yoda is swallowing that frog, right? So think of that kind of image of what people would have had put in their minds. That literally the scribes and Pharisees are trying to swallow a camel. Jesus is trying to show the ridiculous nature of their tendency to care about the tiny things of the law, the minuscule details. That they take care of the tithes of herbs and all this. But they don't pay attention to love of God and love of neighbor. And so you see Jesus kind of calling them out for this two-facedness. And then one of my favorites is Jesus says to Herod, whenever he sends his messengers to say, "Are you the John the Baptist, or are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "Go tell that fox." Now, I have actually heard that the more accurate Aramaic translation of that would be, "Go tell that skunk." Ooh. Hashtag biblical burn. And what Jesus actually does in that moment is he's calling out the most powerful man in Judea. He's calling out the king of the time to say, "Hey, I'm not scared of you." Because then what does he say? He says, I must continue on my journey this day and the next until it is completed. And what is that completion? Ultimately, it's the cross. So Jesus is basically laughing in the face of death at this moment. He's defying the powers that be. And with a little bit of humor, because calling a king a skunk would be something that's rather, did you say that? Oh my gosh. It had been something very, very striking to them. And I think that's important for each one of us to remember, because I kind of wondered if some of that humor from the Old Testament would kind of go dead, because each of us has a different kind of humor, right? My sense of humor is much different than most people's. Like I said, I'm a big Cohen's brother fan, so the darker the better, the more I'll laugh. It's just the sad fact of the matter. I had, I don't know, actually I think I might have saw her parents here, but there was a young girl in one of our CCD classes who, whenever asked me what house of Harry Potter I would be in, and whenever I said Slytherin, she would not talk to me for weeks on end. It's just true. But I think that's really important for us to remember. And C.S. Lewis's, if you love science fiction, read Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. But what the story basically is that this man from Earth has the effects of original sin removed from him, and he goes to visit this planet where the fall never took place. So there was no sin that ever existed on this planet, and so it's a separate world. And on this world, there are 3 different species of intelligent life, of life that is ensouled, that has an eternal soul. And he actually describes at one point the different kinds of humors that each one of the kind of species has. The one species has a sort of extravagant and fantastic humor. So really good storytellers, so people who embellish really well and can just really drive a story home, right? Those sort of people. That's the sort of humor that that species has. And then there's another group who's all irony. So sarcasm. If you're like me and a big fan of sarcasm, C.S. Lewis apparently actually thinks that's not a result of the fall. And so he describes that all irony is part of that. And then the final one, which I think is a pretty good example of what Father Sean did to me earlier this week, was a group called the Befiguri, and their sense of humor excelled in abuse. But I think that shows us something about what C.S. Lewis is trying to get across. Because I think sometimes the question comes up, how can we possibly be funny? How can we possibly say that comedy is good, wherever it does oftentimes involve making fun of people? I have some friends from high school here, and they can attest that oftentimes I was the butt of a number of jokes. And as a result, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Like, are we allowed to make fun of other people, or is that a sin? And I think that's a question we really have to grapple with. Because I think one of the things that C.S. Lewis points out in that book is essentially that sort of abusive sense of humor. So like Father Sean making fun of me for not smiling is really something to where, can you take it? Right? Like if you're secure in who you are, why does it matter if somebody makes fun of you? And without the fall, without ever having human sinfulness where we get that nasty old pride thing, that nasty old selfishness thing, all those other nasty things, or that nasty jealousy thing, I think that senses of humor excelling in abuse are something that's not going to offend people. Because it's like, yeah, you're right. I'm a weirdo. It's okay. I'm short. Whatever, like it's all there. But I think that shows us something about the fact that each and every one of us needs to learn to appreciate our own sense of humor. Because all the saints had a different kind of sense of humor and could be kind of like funny at different times. So there's this one English martyr who, as he was going to be hanged at the gallows, as he's going to be hung for his faith, there's this Anglican clergyman who is, well, let's say that he rather liked his food. And as he's going there, this rather robust clergyman says to this English martyr, "Do you not fear death?" And this English martyr responds back, "I fear death about as much as you fear your dinner." Burn. And that's what he said as he went to the gallows in the face of death. And then St. Thomas More, another English martyr, as he was putting his head on the chopping block, literally, he said, "Can you please clear away my beard? It has committed no treason." And then we even say St. Lawrence, one of the patron saints of one of our parishes, who's actually the patron saint of comedy. But St. Lawrence was actually being grilled to death, literally, on a grill. And as he was lying on that grill, do you know what he said to his executioner at one point? "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." In the face of death, they were able to find humor. Many of the saints were. And it's kind of a funny thing, and it's something that I think is important for us to reflect on. This great gift that they had for even in the midst of that great trial, because I think that's one of the great things that humor does. What is better than when you're sad to have somebody make you laugh? What is better whenever you're perhaps down than to perhaps make somebody smile? I know that whenever I'm down, I always go back to fail without my, some of my favorite YouTube videos from my past, like whether they're bad lip reading videos whether they're how it should have ended videos, all those different kind of things, or Key and Peele skits. Like, there's different things I go back to because laughter has this ability to raise our spirits. And even the ability to laugh in the face of the death, I think, points out something to us about the nature of comedy, the nature of humor, which is meant to convey truth to us, right? That humor is meant to help us to face reality in a very specific way. Have you ever listened to a really good comedian, and whenever he or she says something, been like, that's so true? It's one of those deep realities. It's one of those things about why, even though I can't watch him all that much anymore, but why I love Bill Burr. It's this sort of gift to be able to speak truth. That real comedy does not just simply make ridiculous situations, but real comedy actually speaks something to the truth of our situation and is actually able to insert a little bit of humor into those everyday sort of situations. And I think of that even like in the midst of trial of St. Joan of Arc, who was one of my favorite saints. But Mark Twain details a story about whenever Joan of Arc, so she had 2 trials, but her first trial, which she passed with flying colors, she was being questioned by a bunch of theologians, a bunch of bishops, and a bunch of priests about whether or not she was Orthodox, whether or not she had the correct set of Catholic beliefs. And she had won over most of the crowd, but at this point, after making this comment, she won over the crowd for everyone except for one person. But she's being questioned by all these different people, answering these questions. And this one man so she's in France, this one man asked her a question, and he is from the southern part of France, which speaks a rather dirty dialect of French. So kind of like all those people from Valothia who can't speak, right? He has this very bad accent, and he's asking her about these voices that she hears. He asks, do your voices speak in French or Latin? And she says, well, they speak better French than you. And at that point, everyone else, every single one of the other priests and bishops laughs, and while this man is upset, everyone else she has won over. She used that to help her obtain their trust, because they realized this isn't a crazy woman, this is just some normal little peasant girl that is very quick with her wit, very smart, and very grounded. And so she used her humor to win over people in that situation. And I think we must also be careful about when we use humor, because you can also be overly abusive, right? So we can be cruel to people using humor. I mean, watch comedians today sometimes, watch some different comedy sketch shows and all those different things, and they can be rather cruel to certain groups of people. And it's not an excuse to be mean or cruel. And I think an example of this comes from one of my favorite writers who was a Catholic convert, but Hilaire Belloc. He was going on pilgrimage somewhere in Europe, but he went into this very giant church, even bigger than St. Joe, this large cathedral. And he went into this church and he was praying his rosary. And no one else is in this church, absolutely no one. But then this old woman comes in and she walks up to his pew and she takes her cane up and she prods him. And he ignores her. He's like, I'm just going to keep praying. So he just keeps praying his rosary. She pokes him again and he's getting real upset and he just keeps praying. And the third time she pokes him and she says, "You're in my seat." And then he responds very uncharitably, "Go to hell." That's a bad example of how you use humor, okay? But it shows that sort of thing that I think we are imperfect. And I think that's one thing I want to convey as we kind of wrap up this, talk, is that each of us has a sense of humor. Each one of us, as I've already said, have our own unique gifts and talents. And I think really to make a joke, to make an attempt to make somebody laugh, is really an act of courage. Because think about it. Who wants to have a joke that falls flat? That's one of the most terrifying things to have happen in the world. To take the chance to make somebody laugh and they not laugh. So, for example, where did Noah keep the bees on the ark? in the archives. See, really bad joke. Like, I do not get puns at all. But I have a friend who loves puns, absolutely loves them. And you know, that's part of his personality, and I've come to appreciate it, and I can laugh at them now. But I think that's an example of like where we need to each own our own styles of humor. We need to own who God made us to be. Let's stop being this sort of sissy thing to where comedy has come to be put on the sideline. Oh, I don't want to be offensive. Now, you shouldn't be offensive, as I've already pointed out. But be a little edgy. If you're edgy, be edgy. Like I had to teach myself that. That's my style. It's okay. People are going to get upset. I'll live. They'll live. But we need to be willing to go out of our own zones, because guess what? If you act like who God is truly calling you to be, that's going to make the person next to you more comfortable, your spouse, your family, your friends, more comfortable to be who God created them to be. That as we share our own styles and sensitive humor, what the Lord should be really working in our hearts is this knowledge that we are loved by Him. Each of us is a unique creation. Each of us has our own specific gifts and talents that no one else has. And each of us is loved in a unique, unrepeatable way by God. Each of us is a result of a thought of God. And so I think it's really important for us to drive that point home. And I think that's so important for us to keep in mind, that God desires our good. God desires for us to have joy in our lives. He desires for us to have laughter. And in fact, oftentimes I found that large Catholic families are oftentimes places of great laughter. They can be places of great pain and great frustration too, for sure. That's no doubt. But I think to share that gift of laughter, that gift of joy, is something that can never really pass us by. It's something that God desires for each and every one of us. He gave us humor because He wanted us to be happy. He wanted us each to have something different to bring to the table. And so whatever your sense of humor is, whatever your humor style is, own it. And own it with pride. And again, own it, because guess what? You're going to mess up. You may end up being a little cruel. You may end up offering a joke at a rather inopportune time. We're going to mess up. It's going to be okay. I promise. If nothing else that you take away tonight, I want you to live in accord with God's commandments. That is one thing I do not want you to think I'm not saying. However, we sometimes think that we need to stay within this constricted box. But that is not what God has done for us. God has laid down certain things, the 10 Commandments. There's no changing that. What Jesus said, there's no changing that. What the Bible says, there's no changing that. But God did create you, and God has shown us with many different books of the Bible, many different saints of different styles, of different levels of nicety, and different levels of irritability and upfrontness. And we must become who God is calling us to be if we want to set this world on fire, if we want to fill this world with laughter, if we want to fill this world with joy. There are many other stories I could share about a number of saints. I'm thinking of, as I'm closing up, I'm like, darn it, I didn't tell this story, that story, that story. There's so many stories of the saints that I love. But in short, I want each and every one of you to know that humor is not only allowed, but indeed a great good given to us by a loving God. And that each and every one of you has something to bring to the table whenever it comes to humor. And that we should never fear if any joke falls flat. But instead live with the knowledge that each and every one of us is a beloved son or daughter of a most high, loving God. And that will be it this evening. Are there any questions? We will at the end, don't worry. Are there any questions?
Any good jokes?
You have a question?
How do you like your coffee, Father Jared?
I like it like I like my soul, dark and bitter.
No questions at all? Anything? Sure.
This isn't about like a funny bone, but you mentioned like different books. Okay. You mentioned like the Catholic faith has more books than like different Protestants. I grew up Baptist and was a convert. So why are there more books in the Catholic Bible than others?
Okay, great question. So the question is, did everybody hear the question, actually? Okay, so the question is, why does the Catholic Bible have more books than the Protestant Bible, and also the Orthodox have more books than we do, but we'll go into the difference between Catholic and Protestant. So the debate breaks down to one simple fact. So during the lifetime of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible contained 70 books as the Catholic, in the Old Testament, as the Catholic Bible does today. And that was called the Septuagint. And it was all in Greek. So at the time that Jesus was living, that was the Bible that was in use, because that was what the scholars of the law used, and Greek was kind of the language in vogue at the time. Now what happens is, throughout history, St. Jerome is the first one to kind of he still thought that they were inspired, but they thought they were lesser. The other books, because there's about 7 books in the Bible, J.T. Webb and the Two Macabres, that's what it is, yeah. So, I'm sorry, it's a mnemonic. So there's 7 books in the Bible that are not in the Protestant Bible. And what happened is that there are specific books that there is no Hebrew. So Hebrew is the original language of the Israelite people, right? So there's no original manuscript. It doesn't mean that those books weren't written in Hebrew. It just means that those books have no original manuscript in Hebrew.
What about the...
So just wait. So what happens then is that the question becomes, well, if there is no original copy in Hebrew, can we include it in the canon? And what happens also is that in about the year 90, so the gathering of a bunch of the Jewish leaders throughout the world, following the fall of the temple, decide that they're going to vote out those 7 books that don't have a Hebrew original manuscript from their edition of the Bible, from their edition of the Old Testament. And then what the early Christians decided to do was that we will simply keep all the books that were around whenever Jesus was around. And so that's what they decided to do. Jerome questions a little bit, and then when the Protestants come along, they look, and so they don't have this historical knowledge that we have now. And so what Martin Luther sees is, okay, Catholics have all these extra books, but all the Jewish people living around me only have 63. And so then he goes with that. And the Catholic Church is like, well, we don't really know the historical basis of why we did that, but we're just going to stick with that for now. And then over time, I think that history's kind of borne out that they were right in that, in my opinion. Again, that's my opinion. But that's kind of why. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
What about the scrolls that they found in the desert?
So the scrolls, yeah. So those are a bunch of different books. So there are a number of original manuscripts.
What language are they in?
Most of them are in Hebrew, because the Qumran community mostly painted in Hebrew because they wanted to be exclusively Jewish, so they only used the Hebrew language. There were some Jewish schools there too, but mostly Hebrew. So.
Any other questions?
Who was the biggest influence on your humor and how you bring it into your homilies and so forth?
So the question is, who was the biggest influence on my humor and how I bring it into my homilies? It's a really good question. So I think in part, it's one part Father Dan Schmidtmeyer, who you may know. So he was assigned to my home parish whenever I was in my junior and senior year of high school. So I was very close with him, and he has a very kind of, speaking of abusive sense of humor, quite the abusive sense of humor. So that was a big influence on me, but I think also just, part of it was also a priest, Father Bob Robeson, who really wanted to inspire me to be the best man I could be, and really wanted to inspire me to be myself. And so I think he was my college seminary rector, and so great man. Never felt so right to call a priest father, but he also influenced me, perhaps not in the humor aspect, but to own who I was. So that's kind of where I would consider those two to be the biggest influences. So, yeah. Any other questions?